Okay, uh, let's go on. Capitalist crisis theory in Marx. In Marx, there are not one actually, but three different theories of crisis. Not so different. They are related, but still must be kept different, distinct. I'm sorry. One is the notion of underconsumption, the other is disproportionality, and the third is the falling rate of profit. The first theory, underconsumption, is a general theory, actually. It's originating from different writers, but Thomas Malthus, the classical political economist, not according to Marx, actually, but according to the history of economic analysis conception in general, Marx considers only Smith and Ricardo as classical writers, but still today we consider Thomas Malthus as belonging to the classical school of thought. It's anyway, Malthus argues that in a capitalist society, the capitalist accumulation process will bring about the tendency for the total demand to be less than total supply, total output produced in the economy. And related to this theory, of course, he also has an interesting policy implication, policy proposal, actually. This idea starts with David Ricardo. David Ricardo says basically that because of the existence of rent, capitalist accumulation process will come to a stop. Stationary state, he calls it. There will be no capitalist accumulation, everything will stop, and therefore poverty will develop, etc. But his idea, Ricardo's idea, is based upon the importance of rents. Capitalists are forced to pay a greater portion of their profits, the surplus created in the production process, to the landlords as rents, and in the end, of course, all the surplus will go to the rents. Therefore, there will be no profits, and since there's no profit, there will be no extra continuing capital accumulation process. But on the other hand, Malthus, interestingly, argues that there's this tendency for underconsumption to emerge actually in a capitalist society because in general the purchasing power of the masses will decrease. The reason is simple actually. There are three classes within the society basically. This is a class structure model, remember. Capitalists, landlords, and workers. Workers' consumption cannot increase in general because it's based upon the Malthusian population theory, right? And population follows a geometric sequence, 1, 2, 4, 8, etc. So, but on the other hand, food supply will follow an arithmetic sequence, 1, 2, 3, etc. So in the end, there will be a shortage of food, grain, corn, whatever, throughout the capitalist accumulation process. So this will limit the increasing population. Remember, within the classical political economy, labor supply depends on population. It's a long-run analysis, right? In the neoclassical school, population is considered as an external variable, autonomous variable that cannot be changed. But within the classical perspective, it's a long-run analysis. So in the long run, population also changes, and the population theory that the classical school adopts is a Malthusian theory, actually. And this Malthusian theory is the basic understanding of the working of capitalism, of the labor market in general. labor supply depends on population, and population increase will be limited by some food shortage eventually. That will eventually be developed. So there'll be pressure upon population because of the deficiency of food in general. Labor demand depends on capital accumulation process, right? Remember, capital is considered as having two parts. One is the constant capital and the variable capital or fixed capital or variable capital. Variable capital is the portion of capital that is used to pay wages, and constant capital is the portion of capital that is used to pay machines and equipment, etc. So labor demand depends on capital accumulation. As profits increase, therefore capitalists will have a greater amount of variable capital, and they will hire greater number of people, etc. But everything depends on capital accumulation. On the other hand, labor supply depends on population. So in the long run, we can say that workers' consumption will be very low because the workers' wages actually will be at their subsistence level, just barely enough to survive. So this subsistence level sometimes includes, as in Ricardo, for example, also some cultural needs, but usually it's bare physical. It refers to physical needs, eating, surviving at the minimal level, so to speak, as in today, maybe, right? So the consumption will be low on the part of the workers. Capitalists do not consume much because they are concerned with increasing their profits and therefore investing these profits into the capital accumulation process. So their tendency to consume, propensity to consume, so to speak, will be low. Therefore, there will be sooner or later a deficiency of demand. Total output will be greater than total demand in general, or because of this. And as a solution to this, actually, Malthus proposes that landlords is an important class that would prevent this from happening, because the basic function of the landlords is to consume, right? They are having great leisure time, they have money, they are paid rents and so forth. They are sophisticated people, of course. Their consumption is high. According to Ricardo, for example, landlords are just like parasites on the society, on the accumulation process, because of the existence of rent and the increasing rent. Capitalist accumulation process will come to a stop, but according to Malthus, landlords is an important class because their basic function is to keep purchasing power, aggregately speaking, of course, purchasing power to be high enough to support the accumulation process in general. But without the existence of the landlord class, we can say that, Malthus argues that, basically implies that there will be some phenomenon of underconsumption. This is his theory. So his theory depends on two important ideas. One is the population theory, his population theory, and the second is the theory of decreasing returns, so to speak. We are not talking about marginal returns or marginal productivity, but decreasing productivity is an important ingredient of the classical school in general. The law of decreasing productivity or decreasing returns is an important feature of agricultural production in general, according to Ricardo. And Ricardo attaches great importance to the agricultural process as the basic sector of the economy, basic sector that determines the capitalist accumulation process. So the law of this decreasing returns will bring about a slowdown of the aggregate production in general. So these two aspects, this idea also exists in Malthus. Actually, this idea emanates from Malthus himself, and Ricardo uses or develops this idea. So basically, on the one hand, we have this tendency for decreasing productivity or decreasing returns, not marginal productivity. Of course, we are talking about total productivity. You know, as the the idea is something like this: the quantity of land is limited. You know, it's fixed. So as you apply great increasing amounts of capital and labor into the fixed amount of land, the product will eventually fall. This was the basic idea, or at least the change, the rate of change in the productivity will fall. This is the idea of decreasing returns, right? In general, decreasing productivity. So basically, on the one hand, we have this population theory, and on the other hand, this decreasing returns assumptions. There will eventually be a stop almost in the capitalist accumulation process, and the underconsumption theory is an important ingredient in Malthus and Keynesian effective demand efficiency, effective demand idea. Keynes himself acknowledges. Comes from Malthus, actually. You know, one of the sources of inspiration for Keynes is Malthus himself. This is what Keynes says in the last chapter of his general theory, basically. So this is the idea. In this regard, in Marx, we have a similar, if not the same, idea that explains the emergence of underconsumption. Of course, Marx hates Malthus. You know, Malthus was a liberal economist. Malthus also argues that, accepts that maybe the value is determined by utility, not actually cost of production, not marginal utility, but utility in general. So, and also Malthus was a clergyman, you know, that may be another reason for Marx to hate him, etc. But Malthus is the first person who was appointed as a political economist. So he is the pioneer of political economy as a profession, of course. That's another aspect of Malthus. So Malthus argues that this is a general law, the law of population. It applies to the whole of human history. And Marx hates this because Marx argues that there's the law of population for capitalism, but this cannot be generalized into the human history because in each epoch, in each historical period, the law of population is different. And according to Marx, in the capitalist mode of production, the law of population simply refers to the existence of the surplus population, you know, the industrial reserve army that we have talked last time. Industrial reserve army simply means that the army of the unemployed, you know, because of the increasing tendency for mechanization and the substitution of capital for labor, then we will have this surplus population, the population of the underclasses of the lumpenproletariat, which do not have any kind of jobs, and which are paupers, so to speak. So their basic function is to create pressures on wages. The wages will be again driven to the subsistence level. So the mechanism is similar, but the law is different because industrial R&D is an important aspect of the capitalist accumulation process. This is one idea that explains the differences between Marxian and Malthusian crisis theories. But in other respects, the theory is more or less similar because the same idea, again, capitalists try to invest their profits into capital, their propensity to consume is low, and workers do not have enough income to consume. Their wages are at their subsistence level. They can barely survive. So underconsumption will develop. In the end, as a result of this capitalist accumulation process, Marx argues, there will be underconsumption. The total output produced in the economy will be greater than the total amount of consumption. This is the idea of underconsumption. The second theory is disproportionality. And this proportionality is related to underconsumption because it is based on the idea that the capital goods producing sector's output will be greater than consumption goods sector producing sector's output. In order to explain this, we have this idea presentation from the second volume of Das Kapital, production ideas. The notion of disproportionality tells us a story. There are two sectors, again, an abstraction, of course, simplifying the assumptions. There are two sectors of the economy. One sector, sector one, produces goods, production goods, actually, fixed capital output. Section 2 is producing consumption goods or variable capital. Variable capital is formed more or less consumption goods that the capitalist buys that the laborers buy for their own survival. So variable capital is the form of wages, etc. So on the basis of this, this is a general equilibrium model, so to speak, and a simplified general equilibrium model, of course. And of course, in order for this economy to have equilibrium, we have these two conditions. Of course, here we assume that this economy reproduces itself on the same quantity. There's no growth, so to speak. This is not an expanding model. Of course, if we can also introduce the expansion or growth of output into this model. But for the beginning, we have this simple model. So equilibrium requires the output of the first sector, X refers to output, is to be equal to the this is the value equation, right? Constant capital in the first sector, variable capital in the first sector, and surplus value created in the first sector. And the output of the second sector is equal to this. So this is a general value equation, right? And for equilibrium conditions, of course, section 1's output is x1. Of course, it's equal to the sum of constant capital that are used in both sector 1 and sector 2. The first sector is the capital goods producing sector, fixed capital producing sectors. So C1 plus C2 is the total amount of constant capital that is employed in the economy. And the first sector's output will be equal to the total sum of constant capital. So from this, again, the first equation, again, this should be equal to this, right? the value equation must be equal to the output, sum of outputs. So on the basis of this, we have this condition. Variable capital in the first sector plus surplus value in the first sector must be equal to the constant capital in the second sector. On the other hand, regarding section 2, remember section 2 is the consumption goods producing sector. And consumption goods sector, again, output is equal to variable capital plus surplus value. Why? Because surplus value is derived from variable capital. As the variable capital increases, so does the surplus value. So it's natural to consider surplus value as part of the output of the second sector, consumption goods producing sector. And of course, this is the value equation again. I'm sorry, this is the variable capital in the second sector and surplus value in the second sector. So this sum of these variable capital and respective variable capital and respective surplus value must be equal to the total output that is produced in the second sector. So again, value equation here, we have this regarding the second sector. On the basis of this, again, we have this equality once again. C2 must be equal to V1 plus S1. So this is the equilibrium condition, right? So when we talk about surplus producing economy, expanding production, capital accumulation process, when there is surplus, we expect the output of the first sector, capital goods producing sector, fixed capital producing sector, to be greater than the sum of constant capital employed in two sectors. This is by definition, this is true by definition, right? Because otherwise we cannot talk about capital accumulation at all, because the total output produced in a sector, this period must be greater than the total amount of constant capital employed within the previous period. So in each period, we have an expanding production process, etc. And also, again, the same equality on the basis of this. We have this equality. And so since we have these two conditions again, and because X2, the output of the consumption goods producing sector, must be less than variable capital, respective variable capitals and surplus value in both sectors. Why we have this inequality? It's quite simple, because we are talking about an expanding production, capital accumulation process, and the output of the second sector is greater than the constant capitals employed in two sectors within the economy as a whole. So basically, the idea is simply that even if capitalists want to consume the entire surplus, they cannot find enough consumption goods. As you said, wages are at their subsistence level. Therefore, workers cannot have enough levels of consumption to support an expanding production process or the capital accumulation process. Capitalists are capable of having greater amounts of consumption, but unfortunately, they cannot find enough consumption. In other words, the output of the output of the first capital goods producing sector is greater than the output of the consumption goods producing sector. In other words, there's a disproportionality between the output levels of these two sectors. So this idea, that's why we have this name, disproportionality thesis. Disproportionality thesis actually is a general idea, And also we can say that the notion of underconsumption is a special case of disproportionality because, in the end, we can see that consumption goods producing sectors output is less than constant capital producing sector or capital goods producing sector. For capital goods producing sector, there's the tendency of increasing output more than the output of the consumption goods producing sector. So that's the basic idea, which means, which amounts to actually, again, underconsumption. This proportionality, in a sense, is a general case because you don't have to have two sectors within the economy, in which case, of course, we can see the thesis as a kind of a disequilibrium process. If you remember from your growth classes, maybe, such as the Harrod-Domar model, for example, in order for a capitalist economy to have an equilibrium, to have a growth process in equilibrium, continuous equilibrium, the growth rate in all sectors of the economy will be equal, right? Otherwise, we will have imbalanced growth process, which creates some imbalances and disequilibria within the capital accumulation process. So we have the same problem of disproportionality. So disproportionality simply refers to this imbalanced growth process, basically, in which there is no unique growth rate among the sectors of the economy. But if you consider the thesis of the competition, that in the end we will have an equal profit rate, we expect in the long run, again, a balanced growth process, right? In each sector, there will be an equal growth rate because the growth rate of profit will be equal among sectors of the economy because of the existence of pre-competition process. So, but then again, in a capitalist economy, in the long run, there's this tendency for imbalances or disproportionalities to occur. So this is a second type of crisis theory. We can consider these two theories under the same heading, maybe, in the sense that underconsumption, again, is a special case of disproportionality thesis. So this is the second thesis. And the third crisis theory is the falling rate of profits in the third volume of Capital. Marx explains this in a section entitled as the tendency for the rate of profits to fall. The profit rate, by definition, remember last time, is the ratio of surplus value to the total capital. Total capital has two parts, constant capital and variable capital, right? So this is the total surplus value created in the economy. Surplus value could be equal to profit, right? This is profit over total capital. So this rate of profit depends on the organic composition of capital. The organic composition of capital can be defined in different ways, but this particular expression means basically that this is the portion of the constant capital within total capital, and or you can simply define this organic composition as C over V, right? Constant capital divided by variable capital. It's more like capital intensity thing. The same idea applies to this expression as well, of course. This time, the portion, the total share of constant capital within total capital. So it's no big difference, especially with regard to the definition of rate of profit. And also the rate of surplus value or the rate of exploitation is equal to S over V, total surplus value divided by variable capital. This is the total surplus value the quantity of surplus value per unit of variable capital, right? This is the rate of surplus value. So what we do is simply divide both numerator and the denominator of this expression by variable capital, right? So on the basis of this, we have this, this expression. Profit depends on two variables. One is the rate of surplus value. There's a positive relationship when the rate of surplus value increase, profit will also increase. On the other hand, there's a negative relationship between the organic composition of capital and the profit rate. When there's an increase in the organic composition, there will be a decrease in the profit rate. This is now the crisis theory is simply that when the organic composition rises, rate of profit falls. Ceteris paribus, of course. Of course, here, if you look at this expression, you can see that we have here rate of surplus value in the numerator, right? And the organic composition in the denominator, basically. So in order for profit rate to fall, we need two conditions, either when the constant capital is, when the organic composition is constant, surplus value must decrease. Or the second possibility is that when there's an increase in the organic composition, and also if there's an increase in the surplus value, the rate of increase of the organic composition must be greater than the rate of increase in surplus value, right? Basically. So basically, according to Marx, capital's accumulation process, again, almost by definition, requires greater rate of surplus value in each period, right? So we capitalists try to increase their profits, and therefore they will introduce greater quantities of variable capital, therefore surplus value will increase. But at the same time, because of the pressure of competition, capitalists try to decrease their production costs, increase the productivity of labor, and so forth. And the best way of doing this is to increase mechanization in the production process. In other words, organic composition of capital tends to rise. And the rate of increase in the organic composition will be greater than the increase in the surplus value, according to Marx. And of course, this is a tendency. Marx actually emphasizes this. There will be some counter tendencies. One counter tendency is the, of course, opposite case. The organic composition may increase less than the increase in the surplus value. How this could happen, if the productivity of labor, for example, increases, productivity of labor increases to decrease costs to a great extent, then we can have, as a possibility, of course, increase in the profit rate, because the surplus value extracted per unit of variable capital will increase. And this rate of increase will be greater than the increase in organic composition. So in which case we have this increasing profit rate. So there's a tendency, there are some tendencies and counter tendencies. And this may occur, for example, when there are some important innovations, for example, right? In the existence of some radical innovations, which may create some new techno-economic paradigms, such as electricity, for example, or the nuclear power, etc., for this thing, basically, then we may expect such an increase in the profit rate. This is more like a Schumpeterian theory. According to Schumpeter, there are some introduction of nullities innovations, radical innovations, which will change the rules of the game, so to speak. So profit rates will increase, but in time, as a result of the diffusion process of this technological innovations throughout the economy, there will be tendency for the profit rates to fall, and then when this fall is great enough, there will be crisis. After the crisis or within the crisis process, there will be new innovations. So again, we have a cyclical movement of the output level. We may have such a thing, but in the end, according to Marxian understanding, there's a long-run secular tendency for the profit rate to fall. This is one of the controversies, actually, within the Marxian circles. Basically, some people, some Marxists, argue that everything depends on the social structure of accumulation, even, for example, the interplay between the development of social institutions and the technological levels. For example, in the French regulation school, there have been some important transformations within the history of capitalism, starting with the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution is the first step, to the pace of the capitalist development process in general. Second, there was the crisis, 1929, the Great Recession, and after which Keynesian demand management policies of Fordist accumulation regime applied until 70s. Profit rates more or less increased, and then again there was a crisis, oil crisis, technology shocks, etc., etc. And then we are now in a third phase, post-Fordist accumulation process, etc. So you can say that there's a cyclical distribution or cyclical behavior of profit rates. But, according to Orthodox Marxists, what we expect is a general falling rate of profit throughout things. And this is, again, a controversy, whether there's a cyclical pattern in the profit rate, long cycles. Theory is important, and even some people try to integrate Schumpeterian understanding with Marxian one, etc. But Marx, as I said, emphasized that this is a tendency for the profits to fall in general, and again, some counter tendencies. For example, Marx talks about different counter tendencies. One is the international trade, maybe, and this theory was also used later by Rosa Luxemburg as explaining imperialism, because in the national economy, profits fall, and then there'll be an expansion towards the other parts of the world, a kind of globalization process and so forth, increasing exploitation, therefore profits rate will increase, etc. This was used by Luxemburg as the basis of her own theory of imperialism. Of course, Lenin rejects this idea, but his account is not radically different from these kinds of explanation. Profit rate decreases play an important role in the imperialism, in the development of imperialism as well, we can say. Maybe we cannot, I know. Anyway, that's another issue. So this theory is actually a simple one, right? It also conforms to even some kind of neoclassical theory, I would say. Of course, Marxists would hate this if they hear, because as the quantity of capital increases, we expect a general decrease in the profit rate, right? Of course, today we say that it's not the profit, but the rate of interest, actually, which is the price of capital. But according to the classical political economy, of course, Profit rate is the price, so to speak, of the capital in general. Profit depends on capital. As you increase the quantity of capital, we expect greater quantities of profit rate. The greater quantities of profit, but the rate of profit, profit per unit of capital will decrease. In the neoclassical school, of course, this is associated with the notion of decreasing returns, right? Decreasing productivity, marginal productivity. In Marx, of course, there's no such thing, but even in Ricardo, we have a similar idea, as I said, also in Malthus. And in Marx, maybe, we have this similar position. But Marx's idea is more social, so to speak, rather than being technical, in the sense that, according to Marx, this is an important aspect of Marx's technological development or mechanization process. The mechanization process is more or less controlled by capitalists. It's not an autonomous process, as in Schumpeter, for example, or as in the neoclassical economics. Capitalists try to introduce some new forms of mechanization or new forms of technological innovations that will be benefiting to capitalists in their effort to control laborers or the working class in general. Their choice of the new technology depends more on this capacity of new technology to control the workers, rather than the capacity of the new technology to increase the productivity of laborers. And the basic aim for introducing new technologies for capitalists is to keep their profits at a higher level. And this could be done by controlling the labor power. It's a form of class struggle, right? On the one hand, we have an increasing surplus population, industry reserve army, so new technologies will always bring about increases in the industry reserve army. The growth of this reserve army, of course, will decrease the power of the working class as a whole, of bargaining, basically, or creating some social unrest, strikes, etc., whatever. So basically, this new technology is considered by the capitalists or evaluated by the capitalists in respect of their capacity to control, to exert greater controls over the working class. This is one interesting aspect of the technological change in Marx, especially in the chapter 15 in Das Kapital, first volume. Marx talks about these issues. Maybe we can continue to talk about this new technology, Marx's views on technology, next week. Maybe it's better to stop here at that point.